Are you talking about the 1937 partition when we were separated from Burma, 47, the Great Partition, or 71 when Bangladesh was cut off from Pakistan and yet again us in Tripura and Mizoram were like inundated with refugees? With surprise, we realized the apparent unanimity of Indian officials that the Persian Gulf was of little interest to the government of India. Indian officials were so pressed to try and they wanted their independent nation state to resemble the Bharatvarsh of the Mahabharata, the sacred Hindu geography that stretched from kind of Sindh to Assam and Kashmir to Kanyakumari. But this was a geography that didn't include Burma and it didn't include the Arab states. Huge number. It was in such a rush that when Cyril Radcliffe is asked to divide up land, entire cities and entire regions of millions of people are given to one country or the other on a whim. You know, oh, okay, we need to make sure that both countries have access to Kashmir because Kashmir has got an option to choose either one. So, Firozpur we're going to give to India so that it's got, even though it's Muslim majority, and all of the population will then have to leave. And in return, we will give Pakistan the Chittagong Hill Tract, which is Buddhist majority and has no Muslims in it whatsoever, that will then be attached to Bondi, Bangladesh. And the shapes, the borders, which we assume, this corresponds to India and that corresponds to Pakistan. In the 1947s, it's so uncertain. And what I find fascinating is at independence, on Independence Day, the shape of India and Pakistan is completely unrecognizable.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Geointerview. Today's conversation is based on the book Shattered Lands, 5 Partitions and the Making of Modern Asia by Mr. Sam Dalrymple. The book is an extremely rich research work on how the partition of 1947 was not the only partition of Britain's Indian Empire, but one of 5 partitions which culminated in the independence of 12 nations across Asia. The work deals with the colonial administration's obsession with control and imperial policies, which unmade its own empire in India, ushering in a new map across Asia. Sam Dalrymple is a Delhi-raised Scottish historian and award-winning filmmaker. He graduated from Oxford University as a Persian and Sanskrit scholar and has also studied at the University of Isfahan and Firdausi University of Mashhad in Iran. He has worked across South and Central Asia, including stints with Turquoise Mountain in Kabul and with the Aga Khan Trust for Culture in Hunza and Lahore. In 2018, he co-founded Project Dastan, a peace-building initiative that reconnects refugees displaced by the partition, the 1947 partition, so to speak. And if you check Sam's socials, you'll be intrigued with the interesting things that he brings to light. Good day, Sam. How have you been?
I'm very good. Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be on the podcast.
Right. Now, so the first things first, what prompted you to write this book and why choose the title or the name Shattered Lands?
Sure. So I grew up in Delhi, and Delhi is a city where kind of everyone seems to have a partition story. It's a microcosm of people displaced by 1947. I've lived there for 22 years of my life, and kind of all these dinner parties. It always sort of suddenly comes up, and I was working on this partition project, Project Dastan, for about 3-4 years. When in early 2020, just before the lockdown, I was having this conversation with this guy from Tripura, this academic. I can't even remember his name because we met at a conference, and but I remember chatting about partition, and then he said, "Which one?" And I was like, "What?" And he said, "Are you talking about the 1937 partition when we were separated from Burma, 47, the Great Partition, or 71 when Bangladesh was cut off from Pakistan and yet again us in Tripura and Mizoram were like inundated with refugees?" And I remember just thinking that this was a narrative that I'd very rarely heard from the kind of Delhi perspective. 47 is this great shadow that lingers over everything. And yet Burma, which always features on maps of the Raj, is always kind of somehow assumed to have been part of India administratively, but like never deeper than that. And the more that I looked into it, much of the Arabian Peninsula was under the framework of India. And, you have people from Yemen to Dubai to Doha using Indian passports to get around despite being Arabs or Jews or whatever. And the more that I researched, the more that it became clear that 100 years ago, India looked very different than it does today. And today we're so used to the borders that have emerged in South Asia that we forget the other possibilities of what could have been. There are worlds in which, you know, an independent India stretched from Yemen to Burma, and that was probably the most likely outcome 100 years ago today, you know? But a series of ruptures have made this much larger sort of civilization sort of almost forgotten. And so I think
Right.
that's what the title Shattered Lands um, is about, trying to remember what life was like before these borders, before these nationalisms imposed themselves.
Right. We say that Delhi is a city of refugees, right? So everyone has a story, and sometimes, as you have mentioned, that people have different stories from different parts, right?
Mm.
Now, you've mentioned how five partitions transformed Britain's Indian Empire, right, into 12 states. Can you maybe shed more light on how these partitions rise above the partition of 1947 and reshape the region's collective identity? And what were some of the are some of the major complexities which readers of this history may encounter?
Sure. So it's important to just emphasize what India looked like 100 years ago today. So if you think, if you went back to, you know, 1925, 100 years ago today, the the Raj, India, stretches from modern day Aden, what's now South Yemen, all the way as far east as Rangoon. And the 12 countries that you've mentioned that emerge out of this single British colony that had a quarter of the world's population in it are Yemen, Oman, UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, and Myanmar. And so the first partition, which we often forget sets the tone for everything that follows, is the separation of Burma in 1937. And then between 1937 and 47, you get the gradual separation of the Arab states from India. So that by the time that independence comes in 1947, the Arab states are other British colonies and not considered Indian anymore. And then in 1947, you get the Great Partition of India, partition number 3, of British India. But then an entirely separate process is the partitioning of the princely states between these new nations, and the creation of 80% of the border is ultimately done not by the British, but by the decisions of kind of 7 Indian princes who decide which of the countries they're going to join, and their states are hugely consequential. States like Jodhpur and Bikaner, etc. And then the final partition is the independence of Bangladesh from Pakistan, from East Pakistan becoming Bangladesh, and the way that in the aftermath of the 71 war, this massive administrative attempt to try and divide one people yet again and remove people to the right countries, etc. So these are the 5 partitions, and I think the things that people have found the most surprising about the book so far, it's had very good reception, I'm glad to say. But I think the biggest thing that surprises people is the fact that, you know, the entire Gulf was essentially offered to independent India by Britain. These were the lowest ranking princely states in the Raj. Like, you know, if Jaipur got 17 gun salutes and Hyderabad and Kashmir got 21 gun salutes, Mumbai got 0. And they're offered to Britain, and Britain basically has this India. There's this quote of, you know, with surprise we realized the apparent unanimity of Indian officials that the Persian Gulf was of little interest to the government of India. Indian officials were so pressed to try and they wanted their independent nation state to resemble the Bharatvarsh of the Mahabharata, the sacred Hindu geography that stretched from kind of Sindh to Assam and Kashmir to Kanyakumari. But this was a geography that didn't include Burma, and it didn't include the Arab states. And so there's a surprising factor that a lot of, whilst Arabs and Burmese people are trying to campaign to remain part of India, it's actually kind of Indian nationalists in Delhi and Bombay who are saying, oh, you're a different people, go away. And so I think people have found that very surprising. Also, the fact that in the 1920s, Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan, is the great secular ambassador for Hindu-Muslim unity. And and his change over the course of 20 years is, I think, one of the most fascinating things about this book. The fact that you go from this man who has an interfaith marriage, who drinks whiskey and is eating pork sandwiches, and Sarojini Naidu, the great, probably the most important female nationalist of the 20th century, you know, like one of the people who most is in need of a biography in India, I think, today. she writes that she gives him a trophy calling him the ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity. Now, the journey of this man from that point to in 1946 saying, like I either want a divided India or a broken India kind of thing, and saying that, Hindus and Muslims are two separate nations and they cannot coexist. It's one of the most extraordinary transformations. And I think in giving Jinnah this one-sided personality, we overlook one of the most fascinating transformations of any political figure in history. And it's one of the most it's fascinating. Um, and then I think one of the final things that people will find very surprising about the book is just how much India and Pakistan in the 1950s almost resolved their problems. So I've just written a op-ed for Time magazine that's just out this morning. And its whole point is basically these newly released intelligence files tell us that, after the first Kashmir War, India and Pakistan put aside their differences remarkably quickly. And by 1950, they're talking about the very good relations. Nehru's talking about potentially a United Nations of South Asia, some like EU style thing going on between India, Pakistan, Burma, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. Um, and in 1960, President Ayub Khan suggests a military alliance between India and Pakistan. They, almost sign a no-war pact. There are joint India-Pakistan passports being issued in the 1950s. And it only changes actually after India's liberation of Goa, which is in 1961. Goa was a Portuguese colony, and the Indian army goes in what Indians today see as, the last moment of decolonization. But it terrifies the Pakistani army that India is becoming a kind of, military annexing neighbors who it sees as part of a greater Indian nation. And so they begin to go on the defensive. And it's only at that point that they start funding separatist groups in India, Nagas, Mizos, Kashmiri groups. And then in response, India begins doing the same in Pakistan, funding, Balochi separatists and Bengali separatists, including many of the nationalists who will later help found the nation of Bangladesh and separate Pakistan. So I think there's all sorts of fascinating little stories that I think your listeners will find rather interesting.
I'm sure our listeners would find this very interesting because you've given such an intricately carved out overview of the book and the different complexities that are involved in it. People don't understand, or rather, people don't know much of it, right? And I think one of the reasons India, like the 20th century and the 21st century India or the Indians have such a good relations with the Gulf states is because we were almost same, right? We were administered similarly by the same entity, right? We don't see
Mm.
that with the Southeast Asian nations, right? We see that with Burma.
Mm.
With Burma, that ends, right? After Burma, we just see that new business relations, but we don't see such a huge diaspora of Indian origin, right? In the Southeast Asian nations of that scale, right? Now the book speaks of how the collapse of the Indian Empire wasn't just a single story, right? But it was scattered across the empire. What were some of the major challenges that you faced while piecing together these forgotten connections and personal insights that did you take away from the inquiry itself?
Sure, brilliant question. I think the so as you said, like with each partition, archives are scattered, memory is scattered, and so a lot of, the most important pieces of Indian history are sitting in British archives or Pakistani archives. That famously, one of the the Indian history of the Gulf was pretty much forgotten until this librarian from Qatar called James Onley is funded to create a digital archive of Qatar's history and all the documents relating to Qatar's any documents mentioning Qatar in the past. And he eventually figures out that basically all of the archives on Qatar are sitting in Bombay's archives. And so if you want to understand the history of the Gulf, you have to go to Bombay. You don't go to London. You don't go to, Saudi. You don't go to Dubai. You have to be in Bombay to read anything of the history of the Gulf. Likewise, so much of the history of northeastern India is actually sitting in Rangoon. So if you actually want any of the best, the one of the things that I found fascinating was trying to trace the life of Fizo, the founder of the Naga separatist movement and the beginning of the Naga land insurgency that kind of continues in small forms to this day, although mostly it's disappeared now. Fizo and most of the major Naga nationalists spend all their time in Rangoon. Rangoon was like now in Burma, was the closest big city to Nagaland for years. And there are, the greatest rebellion in the history of the Raj was actually a rebellion in Burma that also spreads to Nagaland, Assam, and Bangladesh. But because they are now, different nation states are assessing this separately in their history books. You hear about the Chittagong uprising, and you hear in Burma about the Sayasan rebellion, or you hear about the kind of Gaidinlu rebellion in Nagaland, and we assume that they're separate because, like we talk about them in separate silos. Piecing them together is very, very difficult. I think that it took a long time to try and piece together the Gulf side of the story because it's so scattered in modern day between all the different Gulf states. There's different nationalist narratives. Figuring out a narrative that suits the entire region is rather difficult. And I think it's the most under-researched bit of the book as well. I think there's only one or two. No, there's about 3 or 4 scholars who are working on this. Hanya Bhattacharya is doing amazing work on Yemen. James Onley, who I've mentioned already. Abdul Razak Takriti, who's done amazing work on Oman's links with India. So there's all these people who are doing bits and bits, but trying to tie it all together was definitely a massive challenge.
Right. Now, when you mentioned that the history is scattered all the way across the like South Asia, West Asia, and all of that stuff, I just get reminded of the 1853, let's say, a conflict between the British Empire and Iran regarding Herat, right? When under Havelock, the navy from Bombay went to Iran, right? And then they bombed the port, they captured some of the cities, and then James Outram was working under Havelock. And for my viewers, if you are a student of history, you cannot miss James Outram and Havelock because they were the people who put the 57 revolt down, right? Havelock was very important, and James Outram was the resident at Awadh who actually submitted the report that Awadh has been mismanaged, right? So we can always find great links when we move through history, and it's a shame actually that we don't get to read much of it in our curriculum, right? In India, we don't get to read much about the Raj's history, right? We get to read about Indian history, that is the sacred geography that we spoke of, the Bharatvarsh. But out of that, we don't get to read. It's up to us as people who have interest in history that we have to dig and find these pieces of history and like link them together and present to other people, like as you have done, right? Now, we've read the book, and of course, as students of history, we also know that the colonial administration and its administrators weren't always very familiar with the people that they were entrusted to govern, right? Now,
Yeah.
did you come across any such instances of misgovernance by way of ignorance or otherwise during your research, and what impact did it have on the lives of ordinary people?
Sure. I think there's all sorts of moments of misgovernance and just ignorance. Most notably, okay, take the example of the partition of Burma. It's amazing the extent to which, when Burma's separated, no one really questions where the new border is going to be. And so it's separated in 1937, but it's just a border between 2 colonies run by Britain. So no one really puts a border there. And it's only during World War II, when the Japanese are invading and suddenly all these British troops are heading off to Nagaland and stuff. Suddenly there's the battles of Kohima and Imphal, that you get these Brits being like, wait a second, this is meant to be a border, and yet it's literally slicing entire peoples apart. So, half of Nagas, 1/3 of all Nagas live in Burma, 2/3 live in India. The the Chin population of Myanmar is very closely related to the Mizos, and various Zo peoples, and like each of the Rohingya population is very closely related to Bengalis. And what I find fascinating is how much they then try in 1943 to change the border, but it's kind of too late. they're suddenly saying, oh, maybe we should figure out where the Naga population ends and, have it there. Um, and so there's that sort of thing. There's also so what's interesting is you never get there's never a policy called divide and rule for it, but you get a lot of nationalists and people like Kipling talking about that's essentially what it is. So there's no official policy. This is something that I think a lot of people misunderstand. But what you get, for example, is the last three viceroys, when you talk about their attitudes towards creating Pakistan, for example, Linlithgow is very much anti-Congress, very pro-Muslim League, and very biased towards, and is using the Pakistan demand to try and undermine Congress and keep the, fight against Japan on the road in World War II. Wavell, I don't think you could accuse him of bias either way. I think he's quite a well-judged kind of, like being a good. I actually think he's quite a good viceroy and does a lot of things right. It's thanks to him that a lot of the worst excesses of the Bengal famine get sorted out, for example. I think that of all the figures, I think Wavell is one that we should talk about more, to be honest. And then when Mountbatten comes in, he has a very close relationship with Nehru and possibly, his wife is it falls in love with Nehru later, Edwina and Nehru, but he cannot stand Jinnah, and it creates a dynamic wherein he's very biased towards India. And so today you have a lot of Indian nationalists saying, oh, the British sided with Pakistan. Look, here's what Linlithgow did. And you have a lot of Pakistanis saying, the British sided with India. Here's what Mountbatten did. And of course, what's fascinating is how just each of these personalities is completely different. It's like comparing Biden to Trump. Like you have a different. Suddenly, you replace the viceroy or the president of the United States, and you've got an entirely different set of politics. And today, I think we tend to brush everyone with the same brush, but actually, within the Indian nationalist side and within the British side, there's a whole range of opinions. I also think that, for example, with the separating Burma, there's a guy called Bernard Riley, who was the governor of Aden, who literally just sows anti-Indian sentiment because he wants to get Burma, he wants to get the Arabian states separated off, and so he begins sowing kind of anti-Indian Arab nationalism amongst the population. And he's quite a clearly not nice guy. He's just a bit awful. And with him, I think you've got a very straightforwardly kind of awful colonial guy wandering around a bit praising Lord Curzon and stuff. But it's fascinating how you can have liberals and kind of very, very, very conservative racists all within the same imperial framework.
Right. And it's actually very interesting to see that we have a free movement regime in the Northeast. You spoke of how half of the population lives in India and half of the same ethnicity lives in Myanmar. Like someone's paternal grandparents would be living in India and maternal would be from Myanmar, right? And we cannot fence that entire border because the ethnicity cannot be divided, right? But of course, we have the violence there. So that has to be done now. But for these last 75 years, that has not been done. And it was a very common thing there that the borders are on paper and we do not have any demarcated border with Myanmar, right? Because of the ethnic ties that we had. And it's more interesting that you brought up Linlithgow, right? Because he gave stage to Hindu Mahasabha, he gave stage to Muslim League because Muslim League was shattered after the 1937 elections, right? As you must have read. Right. So he was the one who told Jinnah that you are against the federal structure in the 1935 Government of India Act, but you do not present your own alternative. And that irked Jinnah so much that the man had to just subsequently demand a different nation altogether. Right. So I think people do not understand the value of Lord Linlithgow in the partition of 1947, right? In watering the plant of Pakistan, right? So much so that they blame everything on Lord Mountbatten, actually, right? Who was more or less there to for the damage control, if you can say so, right? Now, pivotal historical figures such as Jinnah, Nehru, and Gandhi are central to your research, right? How did their own interpersonal relations, internal conflicts, and contradictory actions, which don't come to the spotlight more often, shape the making of these shattered lands that you speak of.
Sure. A huge amount. And I think we underestimate how much this was not driven by necessarily like animosity between, people living in UP or Bengal or Punjab. Like Hindus and Muslims had lived together for centuries. They're imperfectly, like as in there had been histories of violence. We all know this, like, various empires over the centuries have all sorts of, the Mughal Empire, the Sikh Empire, all of these were empires just like any other empire, like, and they were full of imperialist elites ruling over the rest of the population. And so there's all these differences, but a huge amount of the events of partition are to just come down to animosity between these leaders. Um, like as in Jinnah and Gandhi should have got on in many ways. Both are kind of Gujarati, both are anglicized lawyers who went to the same, couple of small circle, law schools in London, and were both kind of suit wearing Gujaratis abroad, you know? And the fact that they fall out so much is rather surprising. Both of them you'd have expected. Both are kind of middle class, as opposed to Nehru, who's like a complete aristocrat with an English driver. Nehru, I mean, Gandhi's a bit more aristocratic than Jinnah, but these guys should have got on, and so much of it is down to the souring of personal relations in the 1920s. Jinnah actually, is jeered off stage because he refuses to call Gandhi the Mahatma, and then later Gandhi comes to regret this because then Jinnah becomes known as Qaid-e-Azam and so. But in the early days, Jinnah is appalled by the way that Gandhi brings religion into politics. Gandhi's constantly talking about Bharat Mata and all this kind of thing, and Jinnah is saying, if we're meant to have Muslims and Buddhists and Sikhs alongside Hindus, and remember that at the time, Yemen, Oman, Dubai, and Kuwait are all part of India too, as is the largest Muslim populations on the planet. And so a huge amount comes down to them just falling out with each other, but to an extraordinary degree. And there are so many moments when that could have been healed. But initially, I'd say Gandhi and Nehru basically just like humiliate Jinnah and particularly at the moment, I think when his wife almost dies and he has to go to Paris, sorry, to look after her because she's almost had an overdose of drugs. And Gandhi and and Nehru use the opportunity to try and, whilst Jinnah's away, try and remove the number of Muslim seats reserved in Parliament. And when he comes back, he's horrified. And it's actions like these that begin to turn him into the politician that he'll later become. Of course, by the 1940s, I feel like both Gandhi and Nehru are much more conciliatory figures and desperately trying to patch things up with Jinnah. But by the 1940s, Jinnah is very much the one who wants nothing to do with these guys. So it changes over time.
Right. Now we know that we can say that Mr. Nehru was an ideological disciple to Mr. Gandhi, right? Like he
Huh.
was bandwagoning him everywhere and everything almost until it was the 1940s, right? Uh, with Mr. Jinnah, right? Uh, we are aware of how his political transformation has been a topic of debate, right, among researchers to this very day. Without revealing too much, of course, what forces do you think were key to such political transformations in pivotal historical figures during the independence movement? Like what drove them to change themselves so much so that a person could become anti to his own thoughts 20 years earlier?
So Jinnah, I'll focus on with this one because I think Jinnah's the one who changes the most. It's many things. So, initially he's this wide-eyed guy who believes that we can move past religion. When he has an interfaith marriage to his wife Rati, she's completely excommunicated by her Parsi community. And I think that's the beginning. Suddenly he sees that people just can't seem to move past religion and that it's this kind of block. and that, you know, her parents will never speak to her or meet their child, you know. Then you've got Nehru and Gandhi constantly undermining Muslim representation in parliament in the 1920s and 30s, and that really begins to change him. What's interesting, though, also is how much his early demand for Pakistan doesn't seem necessarily to be for a separate nation state. It's for a separate nation. And that's different because I think, my opinion, what he's going after in these early days is probably an arrangement more like the modern United Kingdom, where you have four nations in one country. You know, you've got England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, which are unified in, you know, Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And it's a, you know, we all have the same passport, but we have slightly different parliaments, but we all look to Westminster, etc. I think that's what so in as late as 1946, Jinnah accepts the cabinet mission plan, which suggests essentially five nations unified in the similar way to Great Britain, which would have been West Pakistan, East Pakistan, North India, South India, and Deccan. And that would have basically meant that 2/3, you know, two of these countries were Muslim majority, two were very much Hindu majority, and one would be mixed. And that would have given weight and primacy to Muslims so that they couldn't be screwed over by the whims of Hindu nationalism. Hindus could not be screwed over by the whims of Muslim nationalism. And that there would be this kind of weightage that that allowed people to work together in the same way that, you know, if you tried to integrate modern Britain and say, you know, remove any sense of Scottish identity or Irish identity, Britain would fall apart, you know? But this weird system where we recognize four separate nations within one nation state, I think was the thing that he was after. And it's only in 1946 when Gandhi and Nehru pull out of the cabinet mission plan saying Peshawar needs to be part of the North India bloc rather than the West Pakistan bloc, which he's like, I can't trust you on this, I can't trust you on anything. That he calls for Direct Action Day, Hindu-Muslim violence begins to sweep across the country, and they stop talking to each other entirely. And I think that Jinnah begins to get so paranoid in the course of 1946 and 1947 that Gandhi and Nehru are just there to undermine him and, you know, are there to kind of murder Muslims as far as he's concerned. By, you know, once these riots start sweeping across the country, often driven by old paramilitary organizations, the Muslim League and National Guards, you've got, you know, various, the red shirts, groups like the kind of, you know, the Boy Scouts or the RSS, or it's these organizations that are not to do with the political parties, but are very much, you know, very much in vogue in the 1940s, that are training young men in how to use lathis and stuff. And then crucially also like old INA members. It's once you get this militarization of everyday society where you get kind of, you know, guys running around with sticks to guard their neighborhoods that you begin to get attacks. And I think Nehru begins to think that it's the Congress doing this evil scheming. The Congress begins to think that it's the Muslim League doing evil scheming. Actually, it seems to just more be just chaos breaking out, you know, and riots. It's much less actually kind of just driven by these politicians than we think. But by this point, he's completely, you know, completely convinced that the Congress is there to strangle the political will of Muslims. And by this point, it's gone past the point of no return. And so you get this transformation from the 1920s Jinnah, who is frankly more secular than Nehru at the time, you know, into this man who is creating the first ever, you know, Muslim republic.
Yeah, I think in the start, Jinnah was very secular and he wanted that the elites should lead the national movement, right? Contrasting that with Mr. Gandhi's idea of democratizing it and taking it to the people, right? And I think he saw a political vacuum in his own Muslim League, and when he saw that people could not get over there, like as you said, that the religion, he thought we should weaponize it. It's a good moment for us. And then the viceroy himself, when he gave him stage and accepted his demand that no plan would move forward without the Muslim League's consultation or their their conference. Then he just got wings to his own plans, and then we saw what we saw, right?
What I find fascinating though is you look at the 1920s and he is considered India's most important, or the 1910s. He is considered India's most important congressman. Now, when we imagine the pantheon of Indian freedom fighters, we never see Jinnah's face there because he later works to break up India, right? But what always interests me is how much all of the major agitations before the 1930s, really, Jinnah's right there in the heart. And he's a congressman at the beginning, you know? He leaves the Congress as a result of Gandhi. But from 1900 to 1920s, he's one of the most important congressmen in the country. And I think that we often forget that. We never see his face next to kind of Bhagat Singh and Gandhi and Azad, like in those kind of pantheons of freedom fighters, Rani of Jhansi. Like in some sense, Jinnah was one of the people who forwarded Indian nationalism the most in in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. But of course, later Jinnah breaks that image up.
Right. And if you today use Jinnah's name and Bhagat Singh's name in the same sentence, it's a blasphemy.
Exactly.
So
Exactly. But what's incredible is how much that wasn't the case. If you asked your average Indian citizen in Pune or Chennai or wherever, if you asked them 100 years ago who were the big Indian nationalists, you would have said Jinnah. But
Jinnah.
we've because he turned so much against that vision of India, he's now never shown in the same sort of moments.
Yeah. Now, the partition of Burma from India in 1937 actually marked a major turning point in the subcontinent's history, right? How were the experiences of migration and partition during 1937 similar or different to the partition a decade later? And what are some of the lessons that can be drawn about human resilience in face of all dangers and upheaval?
Sure. So one of the things that I find fascinating is the partition of Burma very much is the blueprint for all of the following partitions. I think Rehmat Ali Chaudhry, who comes up with the name Pakistan, first creates the word, explicitly says, I don't understand why, if Burma's being separated, the Muslims of India are being forced into this union. Um, and Jinnah, when he's asked, what precedence is there for creating a country called Pakistan, he says Burma. Burma's the precedent, you know? And but it creates the what was in the early 30s and 40s, one of the largest forced migrations in history. We've got 366,000 Indians forced back from Burma after rising anti-Indian sentiment in the country. Um, and yeah, there's a huge amount of research that needs to go into the Long March, as it's known, because it's a kind of forgotten bit of Indian history that everyone doesn't focus on enough. You can learn huge amounts from it.
Right. And actually we don't really know much about the Indian participation in Burma, right? We fought two wars with Burma during the colonial era, but we don't remember anything from that era. Only the people who have ethnic ties, they might remember things, but in the heartlands, we have no idea how things or Indian businesses in Burma were, right?
Hmm.
Uh, Now we've seen you make a very compelling observation that many of the key events of 1940s were the result of chance or even of error, right? And some of the
Hmm.
most important decisions were made almost entirely on a random basis. Can you help us understand how this contrasts with the prevailing notions of historical inevitability regarding partition and the groundwork that was laid?
Yeah. So the shape of India and Pakistan. So the separations of the Arabian states and Burma is decided in kind of 1931 and finally happens in 1937. And there's a good 6 years of bureaucrats figuring out how to do this. It's a bit like Brexit. The vote happened in 2016. We finally left the EU like 5 years later. Um, this was something that was thought about long and hard. When Mountbatten comes, he asks for independence and a partition plan to be drawn up in 77 days. That's 2 months. It's a completely different scale. And suddenly you have bureaucrats dividing everything from land to rivers to stationary sets. And you have, unsure who to give what. Okay, Encyclopedia Britannica, you have A to L going to India and L to Z going to Pakistan. And a huge number. It was in such a rush that when Cyril Radcliffe is asked to divide up land, entire cities and entire regions of millions of people are given to one country or the other on a whim. You know, oh, okay, we need to make sure that both countries have access to Kashmir because Kashmir has got an option to choose either one. So, Firozpur we're going to give to India so that it's got, even though it's Muslim majority, and all of the population will then have to leave. And in return, we will give Pakistan the Chittagong Hill Tract, which is Buddhist majority and has no Muslims in it whatsoever, that will then be attached to modern-day Bangladesh. And the shapes, the borders, which we assume, this corresponds to India and that corresponds to Pakistan. In the 1947s, it's so uncertain. And what I find fascinating is at independence, on Independence Day, the shape of India and Pakistan is completely unrecognizable. Firstly, none of the princely states are part of India or Pakistan. So the shape, if you look on the front cover of the Hindu, the newspaper, from Independence Day, the image of India and Pakistan are images without any princely states part of them. Like they're completely different shape. Crucially, the borders are also drawn wrong because the borders are only announced 3 days after Independence Day. And so looking at the map of India, which the Hindu newspaper artist thought it would look like, it's fascinating how wrong they are. And you've got it was kind of assumed, for example, that Kolkata would become the capital of Pakistan because it was the capital of Bengal that was the largest Muslim majority province, and it had been the historic center of the Raj. And so it was assumed that Kolkata would go to Pakistan. Likewise, Delhi. Many people thought that Delhi would be going to Pakistan because it was the capital of the Mughal Empire, etc. And yet Karachi was Hindu majority. And so the visions of what these countries were going to look like are completely different from the way, most people, if you ask them on Independence Day, would have probably thought that Karachi would go to India and that Delhi and Kolkata would be in Pakistan. And it's completely different to where we've ended up today. And that is because of how much of a rush these politicians were in.
Right, Nick. That is actually very fascinating to know that in so much hurry things were done that reason seemed to fly off the table, right? Because we saw different portions of same districts, same tehsils, subdivisions
Yeah.
in proper English. They would go to the other side. People's lands and their farmlands would be divided between India and Pakistan. They would have to leave their ancestral homes, and it was a mess. It was a mess for the politicians as well as more than that for the people living there, right?
Yeah.
Now, today we are seeing a much larger issue in the subcontinent regarding citizenship, right? And around the question of who belongs to what nation or what ethnicity, right? Could you elaborate on how colonial or pre-partition or post-partition policy decisions, such as those related to martial races or defining who is Indian or Pakistani or Arab or Myanmaris or Burmese, inadvertently laid the groundwork for these distinctions and crises that we see today?
So I think that there's two separate things because I think that imperialism and pre-independence governments create the borders. But the borders are assumed to be rather loose and not necessarily as hard as they are today. And whereas the ideas of citizenship are almost all created after independence by the new governments and are constantly changing. So one of the most important things that, for example, is made by the Congress. There's a thing called the uh, Asian Relations Conference, which is one of the Nehru's big conference that happens in Purana Killa in Delhi, just near, central Delhi, basically where Indraprastha was. And what's fascinating is he basically invites delegates from all the post-colonial nations, all the colonized peoples from across the world who are fighting for independence. So you've got delegations from Indonesia, from Uzbekistan, from Egypt, etc. And they all decide that each person can only have one nationality at one time. Now, this is actually different from what's from the colonial idea, because in Britain you can have dual citizenship today. In India, to this day, you can't have you know if you become British, you have to get an OCI. You can't remain an Indian citizen, right? And that, I think, like, one of the biggest forgotten chances for India and Pakistan getting along was, obviously there should be joint citizenship allowed, and that would have created a very different environment. There were India-Pakistan passports that were issued for a bit in the 1950s. And I suspect a huge amount of the violence over Kashmir, etc., would have been different were all Kashmiris given joint India-Pakistani citizenship, something like that. Um, and just in the same way that, for example, today, Ireland was one of the most violent partition conflicts of the 20th century, but the Good Friday Agreement, by allowing freedom of movement across the borders for all Irish people, has very much changed how, it into one of the most peaceful, like, resolutions seen in the 20th century. So I think it's difficult to see, but one of the things that is crucial is that the citizenship laws created by these countries are all created in the context of the largest refugee crises seen in history. And those crises are, of course, created by colonialism. So there is very much a link there. But, the idea of creating an NRC, like the National Register of Citizens, the CAA protests that we all saw, a few years ago, that was first floated as an idea by politicians in Tripura after the 71 war, when Tripura was inundated with Hindu Bengali refugees. And it was, back then, seen as a way to, Tripura should belong to Tripuri people, not to Bengalis, and these are Adivasi peoples having their rights taken over by refugees from the other country. The Assam Accords and the agitations around citizenship in Assam, likewise, are very much rooted in this wave of Bengalis coming in as refugees, first in 47 and then in 71. 47 being much more Hindus coming in, but in 71, you've got Hindus and Muslims being forced out by Pakistanis who are targeting just Bengalis of all colors. And so I think that the citizenship disputes that are happening today are very much rooted in these partitions, for sure. And I think there's so much. I mean, even Hindu nationalism, Modi, according to some biographers, it seems that he first joined the RSS as a patriarch after seeing hundreds of thousands of Hindu refugees being forced out of East Pakistan in 71 during the Pakistan Army's crackdown on Bengali nationalists. And that, for him, is his moment where he kind of moves into this Hindu nationalist fold. And now, of course, it's the majority ideology of India's ruling national party. But figures like Modi are shaped by these events. Advani was shaped by being forced out of Karachi as a child. And it's fascinating how many of Pakistan's rulers, even like Zia, was born in Jalandhar. Like, the guy who introduces like Islamism and like Islamic ideologies and like into Pakistan in the 70s is a boy from Jalandhar. He's not from the northwest frontier or anything.
Right. Now, I think the idea of having common citizenships or between India and Pakistan, as you said, that we lost that chance in the 50s only, because
Yeah.
after the
Now you couldn't do it.
yeah, we can't do that, because that would put our own security in jeopardy, right? Because
Precisely.
South Asia is too hot to be handled with such intense care, right? Now, your direct work with Project Dastan connects very powerfully to the generational trauma of partition, right? Aiming to help survivors reconnect with their ancestral homes through VR, that is virtual
Mm.
reality. Now, how do these projects on a personal level deepen your understanding of the profound collective loss and the ongoing intergenerational impact on the families? Because we see that new generation is coming up and the older generation is passing by. So, how do they share these, memories, painful memories, often with their newer generations?
Yeah, I think that there's something very special about the sort of work that we were doing because we were asking what life was like before, rather than asking what happened at partition. We were saying, where can we take you back to, and what are the happy memories you want to relive? And it opens a completely different conversation. We'll give the example of this guy Iqbaluddin, who was this guy Pakistani living in London now. His family migrated from what's now kind of Ropar in on the kind of Punjab Himachal border, and he, as a young boy, is forced out of home. And when you talk to him about partition, he'll say, "Oh, we were all of the Muslims of East Punjab are kicked out, and you can never trust a Hindu and a Sikh because they've screwed us over, and look what India's done to us, and I can never go home again." And then you ask him what he wants to see again, and a whole different conversation starts. Suddenly, he's saying, "There's one person who I want to see cross the border, and he's my friend Narendra Singh, who's the Sikh boy from my village who I used to play with, and we remained in touch right through to 65." And suddenly an entirely different conversation opens up of the joint relationships that cross the religious boundary, and the way that in these villages, they would celebrate Holi and Eid with the same fervor and that kind of thing. And one of the things that, when we were traveling around trying to track down some of these ancestral villages, we very often go to these small Pakistani towns with crumbling old Hindu temples or beautiful historic gurdwaras that have been forgotten about by the Pakistani nation. Likewise, when you go around West Bengal or you go around East Punjab or Haryana, very often you find hugely historic mosques or dargahs that have been abandoned or converted to gurdwaras or something. And you can just see that there is a whole part of this region's history that is completely ignored. I remember going to Haryana today has virtually no heritage sites protected by the ASI. And yet there was something like 30 princely states in Haryana, mostly Muslim ruled. And as a result, the heritage is not particularly cared for by a state that has basically no Muslim population, really, because they all migrated to Pakistan. But you can go to princely states like Lohara or Dujana, whose entire population moved that side and whose population today are basically refugees from partition. But you can just see this integral bit of Haryanvi history that is now being lost and forgotten because everyone who remembers it is on that side. One of the interesting things is that if you want to, today you have to go to Bombay to meet many of the worshippers of Jhulelal, that's the great Sindhi Hindu god whose temple now lives in Pakistan, right? Likewise, you go to Multan and sorry, you go to Mathura, and there are numerous temples. There's a whole section of Mathura that is murtis that came over from Pakistan. The god of DG Khan or Di Khan or the gods of Multan. And at the same time, if you want to meet much of the population that regarded Delhi as sacred and who went to Nizamuddin Dargah and Mehroli Dargah and all these kind of, Mat Kapir, their devotees are now living in Karachi. And it's very bizarre. The more that I travel across between the countries, the more the differences are just difficult to reconcile. Likewise, the Murti of Dakeshwari, the goddess of Dhaka, is now living in Kolkata. you know?
Yeah, so I think with the people, gods also migrated to their
Uh,
different lands, right? And people were left, and the gods were also left, right? Some of them.
mm,
And with that, we come to an end to this insightful conversation. I think you've unpacked the lesser known intricacies from the subcontinent's history while also keeping it interesting, right? And we hope that this conversation brings about a clarity in the minds of people across the borders, right? While keeping the fire of historical inquiry alive. Thank you so much, Sam, for taking the time out and speaking with us. You have a great day, and it was a pleasure talking to you. And of course, people, you have to read his book. It's a non-negotiable. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. This was wonderful.